My name is John Visky. I'm a newly appointed program manager for the Institute. And Eric would normally be here. He's got a meeting. He's going to come a little bit later this afternoon. So this program is funded through the support of it's through the WIPPS Fellowship Program, which is funded through the Wisconsin Colleges and Extension. And after we conclude this program, or at the end of Dale's talk, we'll be having a question and answer period. And of course, you'll all be civil with each other. I don't think that's an issue, but I appreciate it if you turn off your phones or at least silence them in the program. And also, I'd like to say at the end of the program, we'll be having we have a sign-up sheet if you'd like to put your name and address and email address so that we can send you information about other programs that we're having. We appreciate it. Mark Brown, who's the Emeritus Professor of Philosophy from WMC, is going to introduce our speaker.
Hello. So, do I need to stand someplace, Chris? So, I'm not part of the program. I want to say something about my friend and colleague, Dale Murray. I'm Emeritus Professor at UWMC and a Senior WIPPS Fellow. In 2007, I was chair of the philosophy department when we hired Dale Murray to be assistant professor of philosophy at the Baraboo County campus. It was one of the best decisions of my career. He was already an accomplished scholar with a PhD in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a number of important papers already published. Since then, he has published a string of significant papers in philosophy and public affairs, including most recently, I think, a paper in the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy on the philosophical basis of the individual mandate in healthcare reform, with which I suspect many of us are quite familiar. He's, at least the controversy, he's also the author of a book on the philosophical principles underlying political libertarianism, which is an ideological debate which is taking place in both the Republican and the Democratic Party these days. I suspect some of you are also following. Dale's got insights in that as well. But even more recently, I suppose, was his prescient proposal in 2011 to the WIPPS Fellowship Committee to conduct research into the environmental, philosophical, social justice implications of sand frac mining in Wisconsin. He has reported on 2 occasions on this research. One in June here in the Southern Talk Room, which maybe some of you were able to attend. And in that address, he spoke to the environmental implications in central Wisconsin and western Wisconsin, particularly with respect to the Endangered Species Act. I suspect that Professor Murray would be happy to address some of those topics if you'd like to ask him about it in the question and answer session. It turns out, one thing I discovered back in June, it turns out that western Wisconsin has got some of the largest sand frac mining deposits in the world. Call it the Saudi Arabia sand frac mining. So we are at the center of a debate which has risen to be a major concern at the local level, in local communities, in the state of Wisconsin, across the country. Globally, people are looking at what happens here. There's an article in The Economist just recently about sand frac mining in the U.S. and how it can be done in a way which will promote economic development, something which I also suspect Professor Murray will address. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dale Murray.
Well, thank you very, very much. There's a question already. All right, in the back.
Just clarify, make sure that the sand, what we have in Wisconsin is not so much the sand frac mining as the sand.
Well, but you have to mine the sand. But what we don't have is the fracking procedure to extract natural gas. So there are no fracking wells for natural gas in Wisconsin, but there are frac sand mines because you can't do the fracking without the propping.
No, I just know we're.
And I'm going to get into all that, Doug.
No, I just want to make sure.
All right.
I listened in the first lecture. Twice, I think.
Right. All right. But in any case, thank you very much, Mark. Thanks, Doug, for your question. And also, I should thank some folks here other than those two. Well, I think I should start off by thanking an organization, WIPPS, the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. As a condition of the fellowship, I was forced to memorize the name. They gave me generous support, financial support for this research. They also lent a great deal of logistical support to put on and get out the word for these talks. Eric Giordano is the director of WIPPS, and he first contacted me to tell me that I had earned fellowship. I'm grateful for all of his work in putting this together and several other. It sounds like over the summers here you have a really robust intellectual community. There are lots of programs that go on, and throughout the year as well. Connie Nicolai, she really makes me feel bad about my PowerPoint because she's really fantastic with graphic design and designed a fantastic poster for me. And Jean Greenwood contacted me and set up some things logistically as well. So I want to thank all of those. And the two campuses, I have a joint appointment between the University of Wisconsin, Baraboo-Sauk County, and also the University of Wisconsin at Richland. And I credit both of these campuses for really having an environment that's very conducive to doing research and recognizing how research really does filter into teaching and community service concerns as well. So I really appreciate all of those folks, and most heartily, I appreciate all of you for coming out on this evening. I want to start off by talking about the goals of the presentation. I think just to lay my cards on the table and to be fair, I should do this. I really present this as more of an informative talk. I'm not going to advocate a position for or against frac sand mining. I'm going to air some concerns. I'm going to air some potential benefits of frac sand mining. And I'm going to look at this and try to present this as a debate. Also, the way I'm going to present this is in the spirit of sifting and winnowing. On the UW college's campuses, or UW system campuses, I should say, there's the plaque, and basically we are, as academicians, supposed to sift and winnow to try to get to the truth as much as we can. And this is an apt analog for frac sand mining, because what you're trying to do is to sift and winnow through impurities in order to get down to the essential element, which is crystalline silica sand, which is, as you will find out in a few minutes, like gold to some folks. So, with my cards on the table, I have to start off by talking about fracking, and I'm glad that Doug did ask this question, because when I'm talking to people in the community about this topic, there is a good deal of confusion. People they'll hear about fracking, they'll hear about frac sand mining, they're trying to figure out exactly what the difference is. And sometimes they'll be very confused when you say, no fracking goes on in Wisconsin. Yeah, but there's a sand mine up the road. That's a different part of the process. And so what I want to say, first of all, is that fracking is really the extraction process, I should say, of getting natural gas out of areas that were previously inaccessible. So what we're talking about are really small pockets in rocks that contain natural gas, and they usually lie in shale deposits. And these shale deposits, or shale plays as they're kind of known in the industry, they are in a number of different states around the United States. You'll find them in Pennsylvania, Texas, and the Burnett Shale, the Bossier Shale in Louisiana, the Haynesville Shale is there as well. The Fayetteville Shale in Arkansas, out in the west in Colorado and Utah and Wyoming. And of course, probably the one that we may have heard of the most because it's somewhat close to us is North Dakota. So you have the boom there, not only with natural gas, but also with the oil fields, but both of them use a fracking technique, right? And what fracking is, and basically how it works, is that you drill this vertical well down. Now, there's nothing particularly interesting about that. It's about 1 mile to 1.5 miles deep. It's a really deep well. But there are a couple of innovations that have come along which have really sparked fracking. And one of the innovations is the development of a horizontal drill bit that will drill along this horizontal axis. And what this does is open up a great deal of surface area in shale. And then what you can do is you can detonate charges down at the bottom of this horizontal well, and you can cause these little shale fractures or fissures in the rock, which exposes all of those little pockets, right, of natural gas. And then you take a combination of lots and lots of water and lots of what is known as proppant. And as the name suggests, it props open something. And what it props open are these little fractures to keep them opening. And some biocide chemicals as well to keep the well clear are also pumped down in this slurry. What happens is that when you pump the water back out, the proppant stays, right? Keeps these little fissures open, and natural gas proceeds up the well. And what happens from there is that you have to collect it at the top with a refinery. Notice that this well is drilled very far below a water aquifer, and it's hard to see probably from your location out there, but there are these little chambers in the pipe which are filled with concrete, and the idea is to try as much as possible to keep natural gas from seeping into the aquifers for water. And that is sometimes successful and sometimes not. And that's where the fracking debate begins, right, with water contamination. And sometimes you get flowback when this well blows, right? And now you have water that spills, frac water that spills into the groundwater, and causes issues that way as well. But that's the last I'm going to say about fracking tonight, except to say that there's a reason why there is a lot of interest in fracking. Maybe some of you heard the speech, and I think Mark alluded to it earlier when President Obama said that the United States is primed to become the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. And there are a couple of factors that go into fracking becoming very popular. One is that for gas and oil companies, this is sort of the future, right? This is the next horizon. And the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that there are estimated by the United States Energy Information Administration to be 2,203 trillion cubic feet of natural gas under U.S. soil at a current consumption rate of 24 trillion cubic feet per year. That means that there would be enough resources for 92 years of consumption. Now you're talking about a couple of things. Natural gas isn't clean, but it's cleaner than some alternatives, crude oil and coal. So now you have something where you might have a shot at meeting some federal emission standards. That's one possibility. The other thing that you need to look at is that there may be a number of alternative fuels that someday may be viable, but they're not ready for prime time. Wind, solar, hydrogen, hydroelectric, to be able to ramp up to scale, to start reducing worries about carbon. It will take so long for those to start to set in. There's a natural attraction to natural gas. And of course, the third reason, I suppose, if you want to look at it this way, you have a bridge fuel And also, some have lauded natural gas for being, since it's a domestic product, it looks like at this point, a way not to have to do business with countries with whom we do not play nice and do not play nice with us, right? So now you might have a way to get away from some of the reliance upon foreign oil from hostile partners. And for these reasons, fracking is huge. And my estimation is it's going to become even larger. So I mentioned there are no fracking wells in Wisconsin, so what do we have to do with this? What is our role? Our role is that we have some of the best proppant or frac sand in the United States, perhaps even the world. We have Cambrian sandstone formations that contain crystalline silica that is pure quartz. And why do you desire pure quartz? And why is it the perfect proppant? It's really, really hard. It can withstand about 6,000 to 14,000 psi, or pounds per square inch. When you crush it into its granular size, its perfect granular size, to get into these little, whoops, it's gone now, but the little fissures that I showed you before. And you can polish it up so it's very slippery. You can get it deep into the fissures because it works really well in a slurry. And more than that, it is strong enough to prop open the fissures, yet on the other hand, it is slippery enough and permeable enough to allow natural gas to come out. And there are other reasons why Wisconsin frac sand is highly prized. Its optimal size is one thing, its hardness is another, but it's also close to the surface. There isn't a lot of what is known as overburden. Overburden is silt, loam, clay that lies above rock formations. And Wisconsin doesn't have a great deal of the overburden on top of the sandstone, so it's easier to get to. Also, Wisconsin sandstone tends to be poorly cemented, and that's actually good for frac sand mining. Why? Because you can blast it and you can get out large chunks pretty efficiently. For all of these reasons, save one, and this is another one that really helps Wisconsin rise to the top as far as frac sand production goes. Wisconsin has really accessible railroad lines. All things said, even though I recognize there are a number of railroad lines around the state that are abandoned or seem to be in disrepair and etc. But all things said, Wisconsin has a pretty robust transportation system. And the road system is pretty decent. When I hit some potholes, I can test that point. But all things said, Wisconsin's really in a fantastic, at least if you're a frac sand mining company, Wisconsin is really attractive to you for all of those reasons. This is a frac sand washing plant near Oakdale. This is kind of what I meant about Connie outstripping my talents in PowerPoint. Sorry about this, a little hard to see. But in any case, what this probably is, I think that this is one of the stockpiles, as you see, where the sand at this point is wet and it's going to do some of the drying here, but then it'll go through a separate drying process that I'll show you in a few minutes. And this is a schematic. It's a laundry list. It doesn't have a great deal of detail, but I just want to run through it quickly so that you have an idea of what happens if you don't already know. In the frac sand mining process, the first thing you have to do is to drill boreholes to figure out the quality of the sand and to find out how deep it is. And all of this will be calculated into how much of an offer you'll get if they're going to purchase land from a private owner, or if they're going to get lease rights to the land and mineral rights to the land. For all of that kind of calculation, for what kind of offer you're going to make, you need to get this testing done in order to figure that out. You excavate the overburden. This is usually done with scrapers and excavators and large front end loaders. From there, You draw up larger chunks. Blasting is sometimes used for this. Some mines blast daily, others every few weeks, others maybe even more fortunately just every few months. And you have what is known as shot rock, which is taken to a primary crusher. This can either happen on-site or off. Not every sand mine has processing facility on-site. Some do, some don't. Some do it sort of half and half, so they may have a primary crusher on-site, a mobile crusher for the primary crush phase, and then it's shipped out to a processing facility. And this may seem like boring details, but I promise you at the end this will all add up, because for each individual aspect, there's going to be something of interest and some implication that will come from it. The shot rock is then taken to a secondary crusher. The shot rock went to the primary crusher. The breaker rock goes to the secondary crusher. And then you crush it into the granular size, the small grains that you're going to use, and then there's a washing process. You wash off the impurities because, again, you want pure quartz. The sand is stockpiled wet. Some drying occurs during this time period. The sand is then sent to a dryer just before shipment. And sometimes a resin is applied to make the outside of the frac sand even harder, right? And then this sand is loaded for transport, usually to a rail line. Sometimes you have to use trucks to get it there, so you'll have some potential wearing on roads. You'll also have some potential wear and tear on railroad tracks. And there are sometimes separate loading facilities as well. Where does frac sand mining occur? Roughly speaking, anywhere from, and there are some places south of this too, but basically where a lot of the main action is going on is from north of La Crosse up to around Burnett County, Burnett and Barron County. And as far south, you could say then Trempealeau County, as far south as there. Although there is now as far as I know, there is a mine that has been going on for quite some time in Columbia County, which is just one county over from Sauk, and there's a proposal for a mine in Sauk County, which is coming up pretty quickly to the county board. So we'll see what happens with that. Some concerns that people have raised. One concern, or maybe it's a series of concerns, health concerns, is silicosis. If you have not heard of this before, it's a lung disease that's caused by the deposit of tiny particles, and in this case, crystalline silica. Crystalline silica is a known carcinogen, but the studies that have been done to determine that have been work site studies or workplace studies up to this point. So for a long period of time, there have been regulations for protections for workers in mining sites in order to try to, as best as possible, keep them from inhaling silica dust particles. Where there aren't many studies done, and in a way this isn't all that surprising because we haven't had an industrial kind of concentration of lots of mines or places where you would be extracting silica near human populations in one place before. You have a few, and we have certainly extracted silica sand for a long period of time. It's used for a number of different types of industries, but not quite on this scale. So the lurking question out there is, if silica dust particles get in the ambient air, how far can they go, and in what concentrations that could possibly be harmful to human health? And current monitoring in Wisconsin does not detect particles under 10 micrometers. And the real concern is actually with smaller particles. The smaller the particle, the deeper you can inhale it. And as I'll show you in a diagram in just a little bit, the dust, these small 2.5 micrometer pieces and bits of dust, are very sharp. So they're good at doing a couple of things. They're really good at getting deep into the lungs, and they're really good at cutting up lung tissue. That's bad news for you if you have a lot of it, right? So what happens is over time, and this happens gradually, it's usually not an all-at-once event, is that you develop scar tissue over time. And what happens is eventually you have lots of respiratory problems, and eventually the morbidity rate can be quite high. So these are concerns that have come up. There is, I'll get to the moratorium in a second, but the other interesting thing is that there is some disagreements in the science right now. Wisconsin DNR there was a report that I believe they issued, I think it was in January 2012, and the report on silica sand basically noted that, yes, silica sand is a known carcinogen, but there are lots of different dust prevention strategies that sand mines can take to minimize fugitive dust, and that the current regulations that govern dust handling are strong enough, and no further action is needed. The University of Wisconsin Eau Claire had a research team that specializes in looking for toxins in the air and other different contaminants. And what they decided to do was to do a snapshot, and they will admit wholeheartedly that these are snapshots from a scientific perspective. These were not systematic studies, but they were preliminary studies to see if you have worries that are such that you might want to engage in further study. And they found that the particulates under 10 microns, the concentration of them were much higher than what DNR had projected, at least from doing mathematical modeling. But of course, here's another difference. DNR does its monitoring regionally. This research team did their monitoring right outside the site. They looked at a number of different locations, including the EOG mine just outside of Chippewa Falls. And so this research team, the leader of this research team, got together with physicians of Chippewa County and wrote a petition to the state DNR and basically said, we need to increase monitoring, we need to list, because it currently isn't in Wisconsin statute or regulation, crystalline silica is not listed as being a hazardous air contaminant. So the petition went to the DNR. The DNR rejected the petition on the following grounds. They said this petition doesn't fly. For one, your monitoring equipment isn't approved by the Environmental Protection Agency. And secondly, you can't really expect that we're going to change policy on the basis of this study, which is more of a snapshot study. It's not systematic enough. It's not scientifically valid. And for all of these reasons, we don't have evidence to show that there will be a health effect, and hence, therefore, ergo, we're not going to change policies. Now, that said, there are two things that have come out of this. One thing that DNR has, as I understand it, done is to request that companies place monitors near their sites. And some frac sand mining companies are voluntarily doing this. Fairmont, which has a couple of different mines, has voluntarily decided to go beyond the compliance standards and to place monitors outside their mines. So we'll see what comes of this. But as you see right now, there's an air of uncertainty. And this is problematic for a number of different reasons, as we'll see. But in Trempealeau County, just in the past week, the county board voted to put a one-year moratorium on new mines and mine expansions to have time to study potential health impacts of mining. And as you'll know, that Trempealeau County has had the greatest concentration of frac sand mining in the state. So this is a pretty interesting turn of events. This is a little picture of the silica. This was electron micrographed, and you can see the sharp edges. And these are roughly, I would say, about 2.5 micrometers, so below the standard, yeah.
Did Trempealeau County stop the sand mine, or?
No, no. So the moratorium is on new mines for the next year and any expansions of current mines. But current facilities can continue extracting. Yeah, so I should be really clear about that. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that. So, in any case.
Well, the applications that are already asked for be processed?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I should find that out, but I don't know. And this is such a recent event. I think we're all trying to get our head around it. But in any case, so that's one set of concerns. This is the concern that I've heard from folks that I've talked to in the county is on the ground noise pollution. And the idea here is that you have lots of deliveries, lots of truck deliveries, processing mines of processed sands to the railroad lines. And this factor is one of those, apparently, if you live on a county road or if you live right next to a frac sand mine or a processing facility or a loading facility, there's lots of banging. Trains certainly make some noise, lots of truck traffic coming in and out. And so when I ask people, what are your number one concerns? The health concerns are there, obviously, don't get me wrong. But if I say, what is your current situation? How has your life changed? The noise, right? Number one, they'll say the noise is incredibly different. And dust is the other, as I'll get to in just a few minutes. There are concerns about transportation infrastructure, heavy wear and tear on roads. And when you think about it, you have a number of trucks going through a facility using county roads that might not have really been designed to be able to handle that kind of wear and tear of constant weight. There may very well be a mitigating circumstance or something that lessens this issue. Now, the interesting thing is that, as I understand it, once the air permit is secured from the state, and once the storage water and stormwater runoff permits come from the state, the rest of the negotiation is really between the counties and the mines. And of course, if someone is a private owner, and the negotiation obviously to buy their land. So in other words, a lot of this becomes very, very local, in a way that local county boards have not seen before. And now,
the thing that the state approved is the well waters.
And that's right. And yeah, because we're going to be talking about some water resource concerns too, right? But the idea here is that some mines will actually put money sort of into an escrow, almost as if you're buying a house and you put money away for tax in order to pay taxes, you have money in escrow that you have to put up front in order to pay for damages that you commit. And that's what happens in the case of a number of mines. Certainly not all mines, I would think, but in any case, that may be something that if you are worried about this, that this might actually lessen some of those concerns. There are transportation safety concerns. You've got truck traffic that can be substantial. The proposed mine in Bridgeport, just to use an example, and there are lots of other examples that folks could use, 120 40-ton trucks with as many as 250 trips per day will be going in and out of the mine site if it ends up being approved. This is a site in a proposed site in Crawford County, to give you an idea. There are water safety concerns. During the washing process, there is possible, though likely low threshold, contamination from the washing and resin applicant that is sprayed on the sand. But even with that said, there are two recent spills. I don't know if folks heard about them. Well, recent within the year. They happened within a month of each other. In April of 2012, there was a spill near Grantsburg, and for about 5 days, a mixture of sand, well, mostly I think it was from a berm that was inadequately packed. So the berm actually was compromised, and water and overburden, so silt and loam, poured into a local waterway. This was in Grantsburg. And then a month later, this was near Blair. There was I think the Blair mine was I'm trying to think if that was an industrial partnerships mine. No, it was a preferred sands mine. A preferred sands mine had a similar breach in the berm. And in that case, actually, there is water and soil that went into the first floor of a house and also into a garage, as I understand it, but also seeped into an adjoining waterway, creek and wetland in a particularly sensitive area. So there have been a few spills, so these aren't really hypothetical cases so much. And there are also some concerns about bore testing. So I was telling you about the test bores. And the thing about this is when you drill any long sort of well into the ground, you can't just worry about what's going to go into it immediately. You have to think about what could possibly happen down the line if it's unmonitored, right? And so the worry here, and this is why there's a provision that when in Wisconsin, that when you drill boreholes, you're supposed to fill them in with cement. And the reason being, right, is so that you don't get some other contaminant that comes along later. So this is a potential contaminant that you're worried about, right, that could happen in the future. And there have been a couple of cases where the boreholes have not been filled in adequately. So there is a worry, right, for later contamination, even if it isn't from frac sand mining itself, right? Water resource concerns. Smaller local aquifers can be strained from pumping water used in the washing process, about 3,000 gallons per minute, and the washing process can occur for some time. There's worry that in particularly small aquifers, right, you may actually end up having competition between local agricultural industry, lots of other folks in the area, and so there are some worries here. Now, one thing to say is that a number of mining companies, and it's actually in their economic self-interest to do this, reuse water. So they'll use a water for a wash, it will go into a settling pond, and then you can reuse it in a closed loop system in order to further wash the sand. Not all mines use this by any stretch of the imagination. Some do, but it's something to bear in mind that might mitigate some of the worries about how much water is used. Yeah, in the back.
Going back to the spillage concerns,
yeah.
Those were just two spills in just Wisconsin, correct?
Yeah, they were both in Wisconsin. I haven't heard of any in Minnesota. I may just have missed them.
Do you know if that's high on a national average or a state average?
That's a really good question. Is it high? I guess you could say you might think of it as relatively small if you think that there are 125 mines and or processing plants in the state. I think the worry is more, is there any way to find out whether or not over time there might be leakages from other plants, right? But I suppose the other too is then you have to worry very carefully about where you put mines. And some proposed mines are coming much closer to environmentally sensitive areas than perhaps in the past. And so that's another thing too. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, to think about this in a fair way, you'd have to think about how common that is and if that would be unacceptable. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Yeah.
These breaches, was that stormwater retention ponds or was it washwater ponds?
My understanding was that the one near Blair was after a heavy rainstorm, and it was actually water as it was pouring down off from the top of the berm, about 2,000 feet. The other one, I don't know if that was a settling pond or a wash pond. I'm not sure what caused that particular one.
Are you going to talk about acrylamides and the flocculants?
I'm sorry?
Are you going to talk about the flocculants, the acrylamides that they use in the settling ponds that help
Right.
coagulate? Because that's a concern there.
Yeah, as another potential contamination concern. Yeah, and I think that was the first part that I was thinking about as part of the washing process. But yeah, we could certainly talk a lot more about that too. All right. Property value concerns. Properties adjacent to frac sand mines sometimes decrease in value, making them more difficult to sell on the commercial market. Here's something that I think everyone will agree on. No one is clamoring to live near a functioning frac sand mine. You might want the land next to it to be able to sell. Very few people, so in other words, imagine that you're trying to put your house on the market when you live next to a frac sand mine. No matter if the perception is all you need to scare away buyers, right? And so there are a number of neighbors who have complained about their property values going down. Now, there is a possible, one could argue from the other side and say, well, yeah, these things do happen. On the other hand, mining companies have to pay taxes that add to the local government coffers, just like everybody else. And in other words, what this means is that in the case of Maiden Rock, for example, there is from the Fairmont mine there, excuse me, $300,000 that have come either through taxes that they've paid or through philanthropic donations that they've made to community organizations. And so balancing this can be hard. But I think that when this is brought up as a potential problem for frac sand mining, advocates of frac sand mining often bring this up, is that, well, we're paying our taxes as well. Lots of activities that people engage in have effects on other folks' property values, and yet we don't regulate them in similar sorts of ways. And you can determine for yourself what you think the merits of that argument are. But that comes up along with dust pollution. And this isn't, and I'm sorry, I should have been a little better about separating, or maybe not separating these two. Maybe it should have gone under some, but I'm not even thinking of this so much as a safety concern, because that we've already aired. It's the annoyance of having dust everywhere, having dust all over your car, having dust all over your property. There is one lady that I interviewed who said that, well, I do the dishes whether I've eaten off them or not once a week. And I said, and at first I kind of looked at her quizzically, and she said, "Come here." And she took me in, and she took down her plates, and sure enough, she says, "Yeah, every week I get this little, inside the china cabinet, there's this thin layer of dust that settles in." And so this has come up quite a bit too, as far as having dust over everything. and the annoyance of that.
John, I have a question.
Yeah.
Does that dust contain those sharp little 2-micron?
It can, and that's what
cut off your digestive tract?
that's what. And of course, that cutting doesn't happen instantly. Or, well, the cutting happened instantly. The noticeable symptoms of that cutting probably don't come up instantaneously. But that said, it could be. And that's sort of the debate that's going on, right, between DNR and this research team, is whether or not further monitoring is necessary. And that's the question. And certainly when someone comes to you and says, look, here's a dust on this, and I'm breathing this, right? And how much of this, is it too large to really affect me? Is it larger dust that won't affect me? Is it smaller dust? It's an excellent question, and the honest answer is we don't know. But that's where a lot of this is going, right? Is that we don't know. Yeah?
You mentioned taxes.
Yes.
Do any of these companies pay a resource separation tax?
Right. That's my understanding, and I would think that from any of their other types of activities, there would be part of that would be just like any other business in town that may be paying taxes. But I could be wrong about that as far as how it works from the county board level.
Non-metallic mining does not pay a severance tax or a depletion tax. Not metallic mining, like iron mining, pays taxes on the extraction. But non-metallic mining, the only taxes they pay are for their fuel, whatever kind of manufacturing facilities they have would be manufacturing. Right.
And so, and that's what I meant about that particular part being controversial, because the amount of tax revenue, for one thing, it may differ dependent upon the county, as I understand it. But the other part of it is that for the amount of money that you're making in the extraction process, you don't pay anything close that is proportional, right, to the amount of money that you make from the extraction in local taxes. And that's the part that is, and like I said, it's an argument. You could take it on whatever merits you'd like, right? That's the argument that's made.
Other resources, he mentioned iron, and I know oil does as well.
Right.
Pay a depletion tax.
Right. As a separate, right, as a separate, and that I take would be something, though, that's adjudicated at the county level, not the state level.
No, that would be a state tax.
That would be a state tax, a resource, but then that would have to be filtered back to the counties in some way or another.
Shared revenues, or?
I guess so, right? I mean, otherwise, why would they matter? For the local communities, they wouldn't matter, right? It would just be a tax that would generally benefit the state, but it wouldn't benefit those who arguably are taking on the greatest amount of burden. Right. So your worry is still there, is what I'm saying. All right. A couple of conflict of interest concerns as well. There have been cases of county board members who issue mining permits where they consider applications for mining companies, and then after they've considered that, within a few days, quit and sign on with the mining companies. And there are two other cases that are separate, and these are allegations right now. These just came out. One in Trempealeau County and the other in Crawford County, of county board members who haven't disclosed their financial ties with frac sand mining companies and have either voted. In one case, one member didn't vote. He abstained, but he did not disclose his financial interest. Obviously, with the case of Trempealeau County, was that a precipitating point for them to put the 1-year moratorium on frac sand mines? Maybe. The stated reason was because of worries about health risks and wanting to study those longer. But certainly, you have to think that this was also in folks' minds when the county board voted to put the moratorium on. In Crawford County, there was a similar instance. In any case, these are worries for lots of different reasons: erosion of public trust, double dealing, lots of different problems. Now, what you might say as well, you have to ask the question, and I had a discussion with a gentleman in the hall about this as well, of whether these are problems that conflict of interest issues that are more endemic to frac sand mining itself, or is this something that happens in any kind of industry, particularly a boom industry? And it's hard to tell. My guess is, though, that how does the saying go? I think the saying goes both ways. All politics are personal, and all politics are local. And it really comes down to the fact that you have folks who are suddenly in positions and now they've got some real dilemmas about what they're going to do. And when you have six-figure offers, sometimes, depending upon the quality of the sand and the amount of overburden, if you have that much money at stake, usually when there's a lot of money involved, people are willing to do things that they might otherwise not have done. And so this is, I think, an increasing concern in lots of different ways. And there are community fabric issues. The problem of tensions are growing. Sitting through a couple of Trempealeau County Board meetings brought that home to me. There are some folks who are really upset. They're upset at each other. Neighbors very upset. Part of it you might chalk up to envy. It may be easy to dismiss in some cases. You think, look, the guy next door just had the land that is going to fetch a heavy price and my land didn't, and now I'm going to be here with the dust and the trucks and all the rest with no more money than I had before. In fact, less money. My property value goes down, and the guy next door, by luck, has this gold. That wears on people, and people who take different positions. Some folks who put the sand equals job signs on their lawns, and then the person next door who's worried about water contamination and all the rest, and now you're living next to each other, right? And that's one thing that also came out of the calls that I made to people, and when I was writing over the internet to them and all the rest, email. And one person said, I want my town back. And this was a community, and I don't know how much to make of this, but there is something that's very palpable when you talk to people, that towns where people were pretty nice to each other and all the rest, there's a lot more friction than there was before. And, some of these things I mentioned before, you're weighing this, right? Job creation. This is also very controversial, I recognize. But the Center for Investigative Reporting, in the Wisconsin Center of, I should get this right. In any case, there is a report that noted that there would be 3,000 new jobs in the state due to frac sand mining. Railroads are experiencing quite an uptick in service requests. There's an increase in freight line traffic for Union Pacific of about 165% within the last 2 years. There's clamoring for a lot more money to spend on infrastructure. And you look at this from the perspective of national security, having a domestic source of natural gas where you're not as heavily reliant on foreign oil is attractive. And you might have a bridge to still cleaner fuels. alternative energy sources that aren't ready yet. Economic impact studies for Wood County, that earnings revenues and tax revenues over the next 3 to 8 years would rise, and from year 8 on, that you might actually see quite an uptick to the tune of $2.5 million per year in tax revenues that the city of Marshfield and Wood County would not otherwise have realized. And if you're trying to meet federal emissions and efficiency standards, here's the dilemma. And here's what's really interesting to me, because, you know, when I talk to people who have a lot of environmental concerns, and I ask them about frac sand mining, what oftentimes comes out, they have oppositions, they have worries about that, and they have worries about fracking. And on the other hand, though, if you think about what you're going to be able to do to reduce carbon emissions, if you're really worried about global warming in the next 50 years, what would your plan be? What would your procedure be? And it's really hard to get around natural gas, but you have to extract it. So what do? And I think I brought this point up in my last talk about the Karner blue butterfly. And it's an interesting problem that you have, right? You care about the environment, and caring about the environment, you say, what should you do? Would you rather burn natural gas than coal? Yeah, I definitely would. I would really prefer to use solar and wind, but if you recognize how long it will take for those to become viable, ramped up to scale, now you're in a pickle. What do? Do you say that you're so worried about fracking and frac sand mining that you, what? Continue to extract oil? Crude oil? It's an interesting problem. There are the windfalls for individual landowners if you win the lottery ticket, so to speak. Some property owners are offered 6-figure packages for mineral rights fees, plus $1.50 to $3 per ton royalties. And that may not, well, the 6 figures sounds pretty high, but the royalty fees, if you, in your average mine, from which you can extract roughly 900,000 tons per year, and that fetches $45 to $80 a ton. And then you find out that the $45 to $80 a ton extraction figure, that figure that you fetch on the market is twice the amount that it costs you to extract it. And you add up $900,000 times that, and I'm not a mathematician, so you can help me. It sounds like a lot of money to me. It's a lot of money. And you're going to get offers of a lot of money. Perminium, a company that wants to put a mine outside of Red Wing, Minnesota, offered $16,000 per acre for a piece of land. It's big money, and it's hard to turn down. A little philosophy at the end. But this is what I'm hearing out of the arguments for and against frac sand mining. Those who are for it are basically, from what I've heard, are espousing the following view. They don't name John Locke. They don't name Robert Nozick. But all the ideas, and this is, by the way, to let you know that a lot of folks will say, philosophy, why bother to study? It's all abstract. It has nothing to do with the real world. It's nothing to do. And the interesting thing about all this is that when people present their arguments, and sometimes you have to ask them a few questions to get them to clarify things, but when you ask them to argue their points, They argue points that you can point back and say, oh, yep, okay, Nozick says this. He agrees with you. You should read some Nozick and this other. And here's someone who disagrees with you. You should read that too, by the way. They usually don't take me up on that. But in any case, these are folks who are advocates of robust property rights. And a lot of it starting from self-ownership. That what I own my body and what I do with it and the things that I can make valuable some way or useful some way deserve to get some kind of not only respect, but I deserve to get something from that. That's what it means to have property. Liberty to be able to do with the things that I want to do because it's an extension of me. The right to own property means being able to do with it what one wants, including securing benefits from it. So if there are going to be any limitations at all, you'd better give me a really good argument for why there should be any limits, because the primary concern is liberty, understood as I can do what I want with my stuff. Okay. When I hear complaints from those who are opponents of frac sand mining, I won't say that they're utilitarians necessarily, but they do look back to a British philosopher, British statesman, but thinker, John Stuart Mill, and his harm principle. And the basic idea here, to try to put it in sort of layperson's terms, is that, look, the freedom that you have runs to the end of my fist and the end of your nose, right? And so as long as I'm not hurting you, right, harming you, but the harm principle is important. And if there are ways in which you're harming me, right, there need to be certain curtailments on your rights to do what you wish to do. A constraint on property rights could be used to curtail liberty when their exercise harms others. And so here's the argument from the other side, right? Yes, you can do what you want with your property, but what you do with your property affects me in all of these ways. The overflow into rivers from sand mining that adversely affects water resources, and I care about water resources, or they're my water resources. This affects me. This is a harm done to me when you do this. And no, you don't get to do with your property whatever you wish. Silica dust levels. Silica dust at levels above allowable for standards for human health, causing possible silicosis. No, if there are harms that are done to me. The whole argument with secondhand smoke in the smoking debate, right? People would say, secondhand, no, you say it just harms you, that it's a self-regarding action, right? That it just regards you and doesn't regard anybody else, so that's fine. Folks will say, well, wait, it does regard me if I can show causal links. And that's the missing element right now, right? Because the way the argument is going is that as long as you don't have sufficient evidence to show that I am affecting you, I get to go on and do what I want. And one might say, that may be an argument from ignorance, right? It sounds like a logical fallacy. Just because we haven't found a problem yet doesn't mean that there isn't a problem. So, one final thing, sorry, and then I'll get you questions. What do you do about noise, though? I think a lot of folks would come to me and say, well, I find it harmful, and maybe you can make that argument. But it seems like what's going on here is more of an offense principle. It's not so much, I can show you the physical harm of my silicosis. I can show you damage that's done to my property. How do I show you damage that's done to me by the noise that you make? when the kids across the street are playing heavy metal music at a really, really loud level. We don't seem to treat that the same as when they shoot us. And that there's some other principle, and it's not just a degree difference, because you might say, well, it's just a difference in degree. It seems to be a difference in kind, that it's a different kind of problem. And you think about it, there are offense principles that are codified in law. Think about public decency laws, right? And the reason I read, in fact, was this in Waupun or was it here? There was a couple having sex in the street or in a street corner the other day. I read about this in the newspaper, really quickly flashed by it. And you see that and you say, what's going on there? And what's going on there is that they're public decency laws, right? And they're controversial. But then you have to think about it in a different way. And it may be controversial as far as one person's pornography is another person's art, right? But what about in the context of frac sand mining? Nearby residents to sand mines complain about the noise from frac sand operations and light pollution in night operations. And these complaints would most likely be grounded not in the harm principle, but some kind of offense principle. Now, I'm not saying that it can't be codified into law, in other words, placed into law, but it's a different type of argument if you're trying to tease these apart. Okay. I have gone on for much too long. I really thank you for indulging me with your patience, especially those folks at the end. So I will answer your question. The center, the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, that was the organization that I was trying to remember, that talked about the number of jobs that could be created from frac sand mining 3,000. So sorry, I wanted to make sure I got my source right. And yeah, I'd be happy to entertain any questions that folks have. So let's see, you've been waiting a really super long time, and Doug had one that I saw, and then I'll come around. So is that okay? Sorry about that, thanks.
I would question that we could base our decisions on the philosophy that we own land.
Right.
I'm wondering where the stewardship of land comes in. Land is...
That's good.
Land is a living thing. It's not the same as some inanimate object.
Aldo Leopold,
Yeah.
right?
Well, to talk about ownership of land and say that you can do what you want with land because you own it,
right?
When really we're stewards of the land.
Right, but then what argument do you make to convince the person who ardently says, no, I bought this property, I put work into this property, it's mine now. In other words, you can say that we should be stewards of the land. What do you say to those who disagree? And they say, if you want to be a steward, you steward your land. I'm going to steward my land, and my stewardship means selling it because I can make a lot of money from it. Doug, did you have a question before?
No, I don't know if it relates to that. I thought what you were saying at the end there was you're saying people haven't yet used the stewardship argument. When you see the arguments going, they don't tend to use that.
Not that I've seen, but of course you could use that argument. I'm not saying it's a bad argument. I'm just saying that's where the controversy comes from, right? Because what is it that gives...
I think it's an argument worth putting forth.
Yeah, sure.
But in the argument so far, you haven't seen it. That's all.
Right.
Right. But my other issue had to do with just accepting that you have these. See, both of the philosophic points of view go for private property.
Right.
Both based on that, and one says
that's right.
One emphasized limits.
That's
and
true.
I was thinking, and it's occurred to me earlier that one of the issues might be, where's the burden of proof? The famous example is in the O-ring disaster in one of the shuttle
Right.
disasters, is it suddenly was changed from having to prove that this was safe to having to prove that it wouldn't hurt.
Yeah,
And suddenly, when you couldn't do it, I mean, when you shift the burden of proof, it becomes really almost impossible sometimes. Here it might be, do we have to prove that this is safe, or do we have to prove it's harmful?
right. Or can you say that there is? Do you side with a kind of precautionary principle, especially when you say, well, you've got resources that are really, really important that you care about, that are in the public interest, right? And if that's the case, then if anything, you should proceed slowly, right? And it certainly does shift the burden of proof, right? It says that
needs to be part of the issue. So who's got to prove it?
who, right, and who gets to control that. I'm sorry, sir, you've been very patient.
It seems to me that the United States is great because they've been able to exploit natural resources. Now, some people have exploited them better than others for their own benefit. But I think that's it. Now, the other question is, what are you going to do in 50 years?
Right.
Because you can just drive along the Wisconsin River and you'll see all these strip mines. And then they've been digging the sand, or that's where the sand is, near the Wisconsin River.
Right.
And that's the sand they use for construction and making concrete. The Olala Aquifer, which is, I think, further west than this, is being badly exploited now. So the ranchers, the cattle ranchers, are digging their artesian wells and they don't get water. It seems to me that in 100,000 years ago, this was a hilly countryside and it's filled in with wind-blown soil.
Right.
And now, if you have a well that's on the top of a hill, you still have water. In a valley, you still have water.
Right,
If you're on
right.
top of the hill, you don't have water. And they've just been taking too much out, and nobody has done anything about it. But it's gone, and it's fossil water, and rain is not replenishing it.
Right.
Just an example.
Yeah, it's an excellent example. And I think that folks with water resources who brought up that concern would argue just in the way that you quite eloquently did. And the interesting issue about this is how rights play out, whether they're water rights or resource rights. And even in the eastern part of the United States versus the western part of the United States, you have a quite great divide about this. So, for example, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of split estates. So what this means for fracking in the West, in Colorado, is that you could own the land, the surface land, right, that you have your house on, but you don't own the mineral rights beneath it. So whoever buys those mineral rights has the right to extract those, even if they're right next to your house. And so with the water resources question, there's this interesting parallel of how do you ferret out who owns that water? That's the first bit. And what do you do when suddenly you find that there are too many claims on aquifers, and then water just becomes another, well, it becomes, I guess it already is, a private commodity, right, at the end. That water becomes suddenly very valuable. And it's something that I don't think anyone has really sorted out yet. And it's a frightening question too, right? For thinking, what are you going to do? The next great worry may not just be contamination of water, but the use of water, or the overuse of water, to the point where you don't have more resources.
They put poisonous compounds in the water, and then they pump it deep into the ground to cause these cracks. And this poisonous water may stay down there, and it's below the water table, as you pointed out.
Right.
It's gone, I guess, if it's down there, at least for the foreseeable future.
Well, it's gone unless you have a blowout. Then it's not gone. I think that, and that's amazing. So when you see the YouTube videos of the water on fire in Pennsylvania. Most likely what happened was that there was a blowout and there was contamination of local aquifers. I mean, there could be other causes, but that's one of the main causes, it would seem. The other, there was something else that just came to mind as you were saying that. It had to do, let me think. It's with what's placed in the chemicals. One of the major contentions that has come out of fracking on more of a national scale is the idea that fracking companies are very reticent may be too mild a word, about revealing what they put in frack water. And their argument is that they have proprietary rights and don't want their competition to know what frack solution that they use, right? And that's a really interesting argument too. How far do proprietary rights go against a need to know? How do you adjudicate between those two when they butt heads? Did I miss? Yes, sir. And then the fellow in the back.
Can you speak a little bit to how the Wisconsin's public trust doctrine plays into all of this?
I can't. So, as far as how public lands could be affected?
I'm not an expert on the public trust doctrine.
I'm not either.
It's been around in the state for a long time that the waters and the natural resources and whatnot
are a public trust.
Are a public trust. And
right.
The state has an obligation to protect them.
Yeah, and I suppose that's an argument that you might make for if you can show causal links between, and I think here's how I think the argument's going right now. I think the argument's going this way. Wisconsin, at least according to the DNR, is protecting human health. And you need to show us that we're not doing that. Right? So in other words, the way they don't look at it as a principle debate. They look at it as, no, the principle's there. We're stewards for the state of Wisconsin. Our policies protect human health. And it's up for debate whether you agree with that. Right?
You just finished saying that there was an effort made by the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire.
Yeah, there is, yes.
A coherent and studied effort, and then the DNR changed the rules, moved the bar, made the bar higher to show that moved the bar higher for the way the study was done, so that they could maintain what they already had in place, the old standards.
At least to not have to change what the requirements are in order to get an air permit. I don't know if they changed the standard insofar as saying these are not EPA approved monitoring devices.
But do they look at this study and say, there may be a point here we will investigate further, given the data?
No. The response, so you're right there. The response did not indicate that they thought that there was anything of merit worth studying from the report.
Political response.
So it's interesting. I usually think, I know that the research team has collaborated and shared data with DNR. DNR has shared data with this research group as well. And what they denied was the formal petition. But it does seem as though that when they did look at the Eau Claire study, no, they didn't see any points to pursue. except that what has happened is that DNR has now asked companies if they would be willing for new sites to monitor their sites. That part has changed.
Well, one of the things that occurs to me with all the conciliatory tones from the DNR is that they are grossly understaffed and their funding has been niggardly, and so that our last safety wall has been eroded.
Yeah, certainly it's no secret that DNR staff has been wanting for a long period of time, actually. And I guess the other thing, another concern that comes out of this is that you can have all the policies on the books that you want. If you have no effective monitoring and enforcement, there really is no policy, right? And if you think that the worry is that even violations are going to go unseen and hence unpunished. And if you don't have enough person power to be able to do that work. And actually something else that's come out in the last couple of days is that there was exposed an internal memo at the DNR, from what I've heard in the last couple of days, that they want to do away with the separate division of, let me make sure I get this right, of science and, let me see if I've got this right. There's a separate division within DNR of regulation and science, and the argument for it was as a cost-saving measure, but now the reports go directly to the central administration at DNR.
To the secretary.
Exactly, to the secretary. So to Kathy Stepp, right, is the secretary. And so there are folks who have, as you can imagine, cried foul about this, because there's this sense that, well, wait a minute, what's going on with this? If in anything, this gives the signal that you're not going to look into things as closely as you were before. This seems to suggest that you're going to have more cutting and more downsizing, when you would think that you would need to, at this point, step up enforcement if you have many more mines that are going online. Yeah.
A question to take you back to the process. You use the word explosions.
Blasting.
Okay, so it's literally blasting.
You blast the rock, but you, so what you need for this is, and there...
Liquid pressure, or do you put a dynamite?
No, it's dynamite stick, but for that you put in stemming material. So the idea is that you try to do it in a way to have the least amount of fugitive dust as you can. And so part of that means certainly using stemming material to keep the blast in place.
Actual fracking process, not in the mining process.
Oh, I'm sorry, for the fracking.
So you had the diagram of the thing going down,
yeah,
and across, and there were little explosions.
Oh, those detonate, no, so those, to cause the fissures, yeah, you use, I'm sorry, so in fracking itself, yeah, for that you use detonations that are dynamite stick, and the kinds of fractures that you get, and of course this is 1.5 miles deep. This has been part of this, actually the contentions about the causing of earthquakes during fracking have come mostly during the injection process.
At some point I thought that it was a sudden burst of pressure with that liquid that was...
Yeah, well, you have to cause the fissures. So you cause the fissures and then you expand them with the injection. So a frac, the thing called frac, is the injection, right? But to prepare the well for a frac, each individual time you inject is called a frac. In order to do that, though, you cause the fissures first in order, and you get them to optimal size by the frac, but you start them with the detonation of charges.
And then when you're mining for the sand, there's not a big reservoir of nice loose sand that you can go down.
Right. You may need to blast that too. Yeah.
Okay.
And it depends. And again, one of the virtues of Wisconsin sandstone is that it's, as it's called, poorly cemented. So in other words, it breaks off more easily than more tightly cemented formations. Cambrian and Ordovician. Any geologist in the room that can help me with my pronunciation on that one? Anyway, those are the two types of sandstone formations. The age, those refer to the age of the rocks and that of those periods, and they're poorly cemented, and they have pretty much pure quartz. So, yeah, sorry, you were going to say?
You just answered the question because you had mentioned quartz. And you mentioned sandstone, but sandstone is...
You find the quartz within the sandstone formations, yeah.
Do you think the trouble with the conflict of interest would be alleviated some if it wasn't so local, and if the local government or county boards didn't have that full power? Do you think if it went on a state or maybe a regional level for giving approval of where mines can be or who can have mines, do you think there'd be less conflict of interest?
That's a really good question.
Look at the iron mine up in northern Wisconsin, and who wrote the bill, which was the mining company.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Big time.
I don't think there's any guarantee that by putting it at the state level. What you might say though is that if parts of that were more of a double-tiered process, right? I mean, in a way it is, but like I said, after you get past the initial permitting stage, then you're basically facing the county board, right? And I don't know. I don't know if there are reasons to believe that at the state level there would be, in fact, the stakes may actually be higher, right?
Well, I was just thinking that maybe there'd be more attention paid to what someone's doing at the state level, and there could be, a bigger exposure if they have a conflict of interest. Whereas at a county board level, I don't think, usually just doesn't generate the same amount of media.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. These two, and you may be right. I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. You're right that it might get more media exposure. That may be one, right? That may be one bit of it that makes it a little bit easier, at least, to track potential conflicts of interest. And I guess if you have more requirements for reporting of financial interest on the state level than on the county level, as I would suspect you do, or having disclosure agreements of who your political contributors are and all the rest, and which is done at the state level to a certain extent. And the county level, I'm not quite sure if that's done as much. So that may be another area where at the state level you might actually you may alleviate some of this difficulty. I'm not sure how much though. Yes, sir.
Kind of a multi-part question, I guess. When you operate a sand mine and you're done, what do you have left?
Yeah, you have, depending upon, that's one thing I didn't say much about was mine reclamation. And as all of these things are, mine reclamation is controversial as well. There is a financial incentive for mines to reclaim parts as they go along. And what that means is that instead of just having so most frac sand mines are open pit mines. There are some that are underground mines, but most of them are open pit. And the idea is that when you leave, say you're mining into a hillside, you are to, when you're done, put new soils in, reseed it, and it's at a 3-to-1 gradient, if I remember properly. Probably folks maybe on the county board know this better than I. And so the reclamation program is also supposed to be set before you start mining. Under state mine reclamation laws, as I understand them.
Kind of like a topsoil, so that
That's right. That's right. And so the idea is so you don't have long-term runoff. That's one concern. And potential contamination of nearby lands, right, if you just left the mine. So it is to be reclaimed at the end. And my understanding is that funds for mine reclamation are also set up in like an escrow as well, so that you pay those up front. Now, where problems have happened, at least that I've heard of, is that if you're talking about a time horizon of a mine of 60 years, right, that's a long time. And costs escalate to the point where if you haven't been doing lots of reclamation in those interim years, that if you try to do it at the end, it's a huge expenditure, and that sometimes companies have gone away, right? They put that money into escrow, we're done with it, right? We've met our obligation. I haven't heard of that, obviously, in the case of frac sand mines in Wisconsin, because they've been going for the past 7 years, so who knows what will happen, but at least that's my understanding.
Determined each year based on how many acres are open.
Right, and they've probably reformed that since the time of...
Yeah, NR 135 is the state law that controls that.
Right.
And mines will have a mining plan, and they will move from one area to the next, and they will take the overburden from the new part and place it into the played out part, and then bring in the topsoil to cover that.
What gets me is that if you're running a gold mine or a silver mine, you're going to bring up tons of material. You're going to take an ounce of material out of it, and you've got tons to put back. But with a sand mine, you're taking it all away. And so, you know, kind of based on what she was saying earlier, is it okay, I mean, it may be okay to use the land you own in the manner you want to, but if you're removing the land,
well, you're removing, the part that you're removing, the overburden stays. In other words, you're removing the sand, the rock that's being used in a processing of some other industry.
Volume of the material.
Right. So it's true. So it is true. That's right. So part of it as well, as I understand it, is that, you know, you're not going to have the land will not be restored to its original condition, because you're right, there's no way that you can do that, right? And so I think that when you hear folks who are really worried about the condition of bluffs, you know, their argument is when you lose a bluff, you lose a bluff. I mean, you can go to a 3-to-1 grade. That's not a bluff. Right? That's the argument that they'll use, because you do, in some respects, and that's why I was talking about the controversy, that in that sense, what does reclamation mean? Right? Reclamation could be that you can utilize the land in some other way that isn't mining, for agriculture, for example. But it doesn't mean that you restore something to what it was prior to when you excavated. Right?
The reason the extensive processing is involved is the sand particles are very specific in size.
Mm-hmm.
So it isn't like you said that all the sand goes. A significant portion of it goes back into the excavation.
Yeah, because not all of it's usable. Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
the high crush mine in Arcadia has 2 half-mile long conveyor belts going from the excavation. One taking material there, the other bringing reject material back. So it's a very specific size fraction of the sand grains. And they're different sizes depending on whether you're fracking for oil or whether you're fracking for gas. And so that's why they have to do the extensive processing, because it's very specific sorting. And anything that doesn't fit within that spec goes back into the
Take a
excavation.
train car load after train car
Yes.
load.
But yeah, lots of stuff is going,
Yeah.
but it's not all going.
And again, you're doing it too over, most mines. There can be smaller than this, but usually they're around 200 to 1,000 acres. So this is also happening over a wide area, not all of which is mined as deeply or as extensively as areas where you're finding exactly the type of frac sand that you're looking for. Even within sand mines in Wisconsin, where you find this very desired frac sand, you have a lot of, basically, yes, it's silica sand, but it goes with the overburden pile anyway, because it's not going to be of use to you. Usually down at the, if you can, down at the bottom of a pile, right, and then you can put topsoil on top of it or use some of the original overburden to do that. Yeah, Mark.
Various levels of government can establish regulatory regimes for how the business is conducted, resource extraction. That's pretty much settled law, although
Right.
there are questions as to the degree to which property rights can be infringed. It's an active ideological debate. With one level of government is national.
Right.
And one thing that occurs to me, one of the most troublesome aspects of your presentation is the health risks.
Right, right.
Silicon dust. So why wouldn't that fall under the domain of Occupational Safety and Health Administration in terms of ensuring workplace safety, the people who work at these mines
Right.
breathe in this dust.
Right.
And also, does it contaminate local communities? But where are the bets?
Yeah, I think...
Specifically OSHA. Why is an OSHA concern? You know?
Well, my understanding is that it would have to be within very close proximity of the mine that you find this. So OSHA does regulate within the mine, right?
MSHA.
Oh, that's right, MSHA. That's right. So there's a special the mining division, and so,
OSHA could shift the burden of proof, as Professor Hosler was talking about.
Right.
Say, no, you have to prove to us that it's the same. That is fairly standard procedure for, say, coal mines and other sorts of resource extraction.
Just yesterday in the Eau Claire Leader, there was an article that said the EPA is considering new rules on fugitive silicone
dust.
EPA's got a role too, clearly.
Right, and they're looking at lowering, basically, to mirror what Dr. Pierce has talking about.
Right.
To lower the size that they monitor and to have a much tighter.
Most likely.
And one last point on this, and I'll
Yeah.
stop this particular issue. The president is putting this at the center of national energy policy. He is nationalizing it. He's saying that frac mining is a solution to all sorts of national security and economic problems.
Right.
And so forth. It's part of his national economic energy policy.
Well,
Why shouldn't this be then a component of that policy? Is the safety with which the resources are extracted?
Well, I think it can be. I think the EPA has that power to do it. They haven't exercised it. I think another thing to consider is that with all of this, policy is often, even though you're right that a number of policies are on the books, but I've actually found that often with the things that are really most pressing to people, policies come behind the 8 ball, so to speak. In other words, you need a few kills first, right? And really, and I say that in so far as the worry is that usually what happens is that there's a lawsuit. Why? Because someone is afflicted, right, to a great degree, or there are deaths involved, and then policy follows suit to catch up. I may be wrong in my policy, and I know there are people who are much better at policy than I am, but in the back of the room. But in any case, that I think that a lot of this, what's so interesting and what's so bothersome about all this is that it's relatively new. And I think that in going to county by county, when I've talked to folks, I think they will describe the rush, and maybe others of you can attest to this too, is breakneck speed. It's like 5 years, and all of a sudden, what is this? And you can suspect that there are impacts, and there's a probably good chance that there will be impacts. We don't have the evidence to show the impacts yet, and then there's going to be however it is that policy follows up. So I do think it's in the EPA's jurisdiction, and there probably will be policy changes coming down the road. But my guess is that it's going to take time. And unfortunately, some probably adverse health effects and deaths. And that's the sad part. Well, thank you very much.